Imagine this. You find yourself standing outside the royal birthing chamber nestled deep in the heart of Madrid, Spain. The heavy air hangs thick with incense, a smokescreen for the palpable fear that permeates the atmosphere. Servants scutter back and forth, their whispers sharp as daggers, caught in the tension of an agonizing anticipation. Within the confines of the heavy oak doors, the piercing sound of a queen's screams echoes. It is the year 1661, and all of Spain holds its breath in a precarious moment filled with dread. At last, silence envelops the chamber. A tremulous midwife emerges, her hands stained and trembling, slick with blood. There is no smile gracing her lips, no proud declaration of a prince's arrival. Instead, she stares into the sea of anxious nobles gathered outside, her voice low and ominous as she mutters, "He's not right." Behind her, the Queen of Spain lies in an unconscious haze. Beside her, swaddled in delicate silk and met with awe and horror alike, is the infant who will one day ascend the throne as Charles II. At first glance, he seems fragile and malformed, an eerie silence surrounding him. His tongue is unnaturally large for his mouth, and his jaw protrudes at an odd angle. His tiny body hangs limp in swaddling, uselessly unresponsive. He cannot nurse, he cannot cry. Yet, the nurses bow in reverence. The nobles applaud, for he is born into royalty, a Habsburg by blood. But beneath this facade lies an unspoken truth seen by all. This child stands as a chilling warning, the byproduct of a dynasty consumed with its own lineage, one that has twisted in on itself like decaying silk. He represents not a future, but rather a curse wearing the guise of a crown. Though the court will feign normality, pretending that the boy who cannot suckle, who cannot move, and whose gaze struggles to focus is destined to rule an empire, whispers begin to circulate behind closed doors. They murmur that he's bewitched, that he is the punishment for their hubris, for a god who would never ordain a king like him. Still, Charles II will be proclaimed king, for this is Spain, and the Habsburgs have spent centuries weaving their own fate through the intricate web of familial unions that have led to their biological downfall. This day marks the beginning of their reckoning, starting with a queen who has given birth to a monstrous reminder of their pride. Royal blood. What a lyrical phrase, imbued with a sense of divine grandeur and untouchable privilege. Yet what no one dares to speak overtly is that this blood is not merely sacred, it is poisoned and twisted back upon itself. Selecting spouses from a dangerously narrow pool of family members, cousins marrying cousins, uncles seducing nieces, has created bloodlines that spiral inwards like a snake devouring its own tail. The Habsburgs, Europe's mightiest dynasty, find themselves at the core of this genetic disaster. To understand how a single infant could emerge so catastrophically damaged, we must look back through the corridors of history. The Habsburgs' singular obsession has been purity. They shunned outsiders as untrustworthy and clung instead to one another, marrying within their own bloodline repeatedly. This insular approach eventually transformed the Spanish and Austrian branches of the family into a grotesque, gnarled tree, one that twisted in on itself with no branches reaching outward. Joanna of Austria, an ancestor of the Queen, exemplifies the consequences of such sustained inbreeding, for her family portrait resembled an unsettling hall of mirrors, each reflection contorting with exaggerated features. The infamous Habsburg jaw was more than a mere peculiar characteristic. It served as a visible warning signal of their biological decline. The jawline, so pronounced that some could not chew, combined with a tongue so swollen it impaired speech, illustrated a terrifying genetic reality. Beneath the gilded veneer of royal life, mental illness, epilepsy, and infertility festered, ignored because the truth was painful and inconvenient. By the early 17th century, the inbreeding coefficient among the Spanish Habsburgs was astoundingly high, surpassing that of even most siblings. The once majestic bloodline had become a grotesque experiment in genetic collapse. Mariana of Austria, Charles's mother, was more a symbol of family interest than romantic love, chosen for her bloodline as much as anything else. Both niece and wife to the previous king, Philip IV, she was an ideally mapped Habsburg because of her close relation to him. Their shared genetic heritage was akin to that of a parent and child, rendering their offspring a horrifying truth in waiting. When Mariana became pregnant, the court rejoiced, dreaming of a future heir who might continue the dynasty. Little did they know, however, that the house had already rendered itself irreparably tainted. The moment Charles entered the world, it was evident something was amiss. He did not cry or move. His limbs lay limp, and his skin appeared a sickly shade of gray. When his first sounds emerged, they were less a wail and more the wet, gurgling cough of someone irrevocably broken. Royal physicians hastily attempted to reassure the family. He was merely weak, they said, and would surely grow stronger with time. After all, miracles were an unspoken expectation within royal households. But no miracle would come. This was not merely an ailing child. He represented the culmination of every detrimental decision made by generations. Of rulers who believed themselves above the very laws of nature, he was a genetic dead end crowned as king. Yet still, they called him His Catholic Majesty. They adorned him in lavish garments and encrusted him with jewels, heralding his arrival as if he were the salvation of Spain. In truth, he was nothing more than a living curse, a boy unable to swallow, with a tongue too large for his mouth and bones that refused to harden. Nevertheless, the kingdom would conform itself around him, denying the obvious realities while elevating him to a throne for which his body was ill-equipped. They dubbed him Charles II, King of Spain, the defender of the Catholic faith, and the ruler of an expansive empire stretching as far as the Americas to the Philippines. Yet, behind the illustrious titles and the richly adorned garments lay a boy who could barely stand. From the moment he entered the world, his body betrayed him. A disproportionately large head rested atop a frail frame, and a misshapen skull pulsed weakly in the flicker of candlelight. His tongue posed a constant embarrassment, preventing his mouth from closing properly, while the cries of an infant escaped him only in muted tones. As he grew, he faced an uphill battle. Unable to nurse as a baby, he struggled with solid food as a child, gagging on bread and choking on meat, leaving nurses to constantly wipe the drool that collected on his chin. His first set of teeth didn't emerge until he was nearly 4 years old, and he remained unable to walk until age 5. When he finally did walk, he did so with a shuffling, uncertain gait that turned the heads of courtiers, who averted their gazes in shame. Yet the empire around him clapped and smiled, pretending that everything was perfectly fine. To acknowledge any deviation from normalcy in Charles II was to confront the uncomfortable reality that the entire house of Habsburgs was marred in the same way. Thus, they lied, dressing up this failure in finery. They characterized his silences as contemplative, his delays as expressions of divine mystery rather than evidence of debilitating brain damage. Behind the palace's grand walls, however, the truth seeped through the cracks of illusion. His tutors despaired in private. He lacked fluency in reading and writing, was described as mentally slow, distracted by stimuli, and prone to being disturbed by loud sounds or bright lights. Hours would slip by as he fixated on flickering candles or traced the embroidery of his opulent robes, as if they were charts leading him to a different realm far from his own. When spoken to, he often remained unresponsive, and if corrected, he would sulk childishly. At times, inexplicable fits of violence would surge within him, resulting in him slapping servants, ripping at his own clothing, and gnawing on furniture. One ambassador remarked, "The king seems more like a creature preserved by divine accident than a ruler ordained by God." While another noted succinctly, "He is not long for this world." And yet, defying all odds, Charles continued to survive, not from a position of strength, but from a grim persistence. His existence morphed into a cruel political performance, a grotesque display of endurance. During his reign, his mother, Queen Mariana, reigned in his stead, orchestrating the affairs of the court from behind a veil of maternal concern. She whispered commands behind locked doors, signed decrees in his name, and wielded the authority of her son's broken body as a shield while she maneuvered real power on the chessboard of the empire. Every time Charles was paraded publicly, slumped in his ornate golden litter with glassy eyes and a head that lolloped to one side, the people were reminded that their king still lived. If he lived, they could convince themselves that the empire yet thrived, even as both began to rot from within. The court atmosphere grew feverish. Ministers whispered in hushed tones, and priests lingered close, awaiting a death that would not come. Charles was often quartered in rooms infused with incense intended to mask the stench of his infections. And when he soiled the bed linens, changed twice daily due to his loss of bowel control, the noble courtiers painted a flattering facade with their portraits, eclipsing the truth. Although he crumbled, the king had to be represented, and the court had no alternative. They had gambled everything on this fragile boy, fervently wishing for his survival, hoping for marriage, and yearning for Charles to produce an heir. Even as his bones softened and his mind deteriorated, the court continued to concoct fanciful plans for his future. They envisioned the king marrying a French princess and procreating heirs that would continue the legacy. However, deep down, everyone knew that Charles was not the savior but rather a manifestation of their ultimate punishment. As he matured, the borders between man and puppet blurred. He was dressed, positioned, and showcased, yet never fully present. Perched on the throne like a ghost clad in flesh, he was a vacuous, gurgling figure. The crown rested heavy upon a head that had never been allowed to form. Generations of deceit had honed the court's ability to maintain this illusion, but it had never been more grotesque, more frail, or more horrifyingly absurd than under Charles II. They were lying not only to the public but to themselves, for the uncomfortable truth was that their crowned sovereign was an imperiled body wearing a royal title. The empire had transformed into a grand stage, an elaborate charade designed to cloak the decay that lay beneath. The grand halls of the royal palace glittered with candlelight and reverberated with silence that never quite concealed the truth. Courtiers engaged in polite conversation in measured tones, perpetually bowing and smiling, ever pretending. If the king stared blankly into space, they attributed it to deep contemplation. If he mumbled incoherently during council meetings, they rationalized it as his unique governance style. If he failed to respond at all, they solemnly interpreted his silence as a sign of wisdom. Compelling him to interact, to perform, had become a ritualized disguise for the undeniable truth. The king was an illusion in decline. Portrait painters perpetuated the deception, fabricating images of Charles II that bordered on the fantastical, artistically vibrant, poised, regal. They sculpted a visage that concealed the raw truth of a decaying man ornamented for one last grand spectacle. Foreign dignitaries arrived at court expecting majesty. What they witnessed instead was a facade adorned with theatrical masks. One French envoy lamented, "I do not know what horrifies me more, the king or the way they pretend he is well." Bah! Banquets were held in his honor as Charles, oblivious to the spectacle, drooled into his goblet, unable to lift a spoon. While musicians performed, he stared vacantly into the distance, and one court dwarf inadvertently broke the delicate silence, uttering what no soul dared. "This is a kingdom ruled by a corpse." However, that man vanished by morning, a reminder of the silencing power that permeated the palace. But it was not only the king disintegrating, the very fabric of royal governance began to unravel. Infighting plagued the ministries as nobles vied for access to the regent queen, who wielded power behind the simple facade of motherhood. Religious zealots described Charles's existence as a mark of divine punishment, infiltrating court life with whispers of curses. Priests spoke of exorcisms, and nobles exchanged rumors surrounding dark omens. As crops failed and storms battered the coastline, the king's unnatural affliction became a scapegoat for all calamities. Some speculated he was bewitched, while others believed he was the witch himself. Yet there he remained, the silent sun at the center of this unraveling cosmos, his days structured down to the minute not out of duty but out of a looming fear. Abandoning him to solitude risked potential harm to himself. Urging him to walk too far could lead to collapse. Revealing the truth might elicit a primal scream. Queen Mariana maintained an iron grip over his existence, dictating who could approach him, who could comfort him, and who could witness him during his most fragile moments. She crafted his letters, forged decisions in his name, and articulated his innermost thoughts when he couldn't grasp the words himself. Charles had become nothing more than a puppet, his strings pulled deftly by Mariana, who fought to sustain the facade of control even as the empire disintegrated around her. The resonating prayers along the chapel's walls waxed endless, echoing pleas for the king's health, sanity, and capability for procreation. Despite everything, his incessant drooling, frequent seizures, and inability to communicate in coherent sentences, the court persisted in preparing for his marriage, clinging desperately to the hope that this damaged bloodline might extend one generation further. As foreign suitors arrived, however, the truth became painfully evident. One French princess reportedly fainted upon her first encounter with Charles, while another refused to remove her lace gloves, fearing contamination from his very presence. Yet the court continued to applaud, bow, and smile, for to admit the truth would mean unraveling the entire empire. They did what they always did. They pointed to the crown, kissed his ring with forced reverence, and proclaimed, "Long live the king." Even as his mind unraveled, even as his body deteriorated, and even as the nation began to die alongside him. By the time Charles turned 20, the whispers morphed into a cacophony of thunderous rumors. Dubbed the Bewitched King, El Hechizado, his afflictions were scapegoated to dark magic rather than the consequences of misguided genetics. His frail form succumbed to rapid deterioration, his jaw hanging open for much of the day, a steady stream of drool tracing a glistening line down his chin. As his hair fell out in clumps and his skin took on a ghastly, waxy yellow hue, his once vacant gaze transformed into something haunting, twitching helplessly within its constraints. Yet still, he remained on the throne, a vast decay draped in velvet and crowned in gold. The court turned marriage into yet another grand illusion, requiring an heir to validate their hope that the wilting body within the palace could somehow prolong their legacy. They selected Marie-Louise of Orléans, niece to Louis XIV and just 17 years old, full of life yet utterly unprepared for her daunting royal role. Led to the royal bedchamber, she was akin to a sacrificial offering. What transpired in that room quickly gained notoriety. Some accounts described Charles weeping, others reported fervent prayers, while some stated that he simply stared blankly at her, unsure of what to do until attendants were summoned to explain the intricate expectations. Whichever version of events holds truth, one undeniable fact remained. No child was ever conceived. Not that night, nor then, nor in the years that followed. Doctors intervened, remedies were proposed, and potions were administered, ranging from Spanish fly to ground pearls to the strange concoction of powdered deer penis. The court remained determined, hopeful as ever. But as time marched on, it became painfully clear Charles II of Spain was a king presiding over a decaying empire, a promise that had long since turned into a poignant curse. Subscribe to Historic Horizon and hit the bell icon to explore more captivating stories from Europe's rich past. Like, share, and comment to support our journey and help us bring history to life for everyone.